Have you ever found yourself alone on a road in the middle of the night, the heavy silence around you interrupted only by the rumble of tires on asphalt? The darkness seems endless, and the car's headlights barely pierce the fog ahead. At those times, something inside you awakens, a primal instinct that whispers, "You are not alone." This video is for the curious, lovers of the supernatural, those who seek stories that send shivers down their spines and make their hearts race. Today, we're going to delve into 3 frightening encounters that happened on isolated roads. 3 stories full of mystery, suspense, and the unexplainable. These stories are not just about the fear of the unknown, but about moments when reality seems to bend in the face of something we can't understand. Imagine driving down a deserted road when, suddenly, a figure appears on the side of the road, raising their hand in a subtle gesture asking for a ride. You stop, feel a strange shiver as you open the door, but ignore it, thinking it's just the cold of the night. What happens next is something that will change your view of the world forever. Or perhaps you're in a truck cruising down a lonely highway when you spot a young woman walking alone around a dangerous bend in the road. She seems lost, vulnerable. You decide to help, but as the conversation progresses, you realize that something is deeply wrong, something that defies your understanding. And finally, there's that road of ill repute, a local legend, known to make travelers disappear or confront their greatest fears. You decide to test it, defying the whispers and echoes that surround it, but you discover that some stories are not just rumors. These tales are more than just scary stories. They are invitations to explore the boundaries between what is real and what is imagined. And the question that remains is, would you dare to drive these roads? Hold on tight, because we're about to embark on a suspenseful journey. The 3 stories you're about to hear will not only stir your imagination, but they may also make you look twice in the rearview mirror the next time you're alone on the road. With that, we begin our first story, The Phantom Traveler. Stay tuned, because this is one of those stories that stays in your mind long after you've told it. It was a cold, moonless night, the kind of darkness that seemed to envelop everything around it. Marcos, a driver accustomed to long night drives, was driving along a deserted country road. He was heading home after a long, tiring day at work. The road wound through empty hills, where the only lights were those of his car and the stars that barely shone through the thick clouds. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Marcos noticed that something seemed different about this night. There was an unusual silence, almost as if nature had stopped to observe. Not even the sound of crickets or the distant howl of the wind could be heard. He turned up the volume on the radio, but the music didn't seem to ease his growing discomfort. As he rounded a sharp bend, his car's headlights illuminated a figure on the side of the road. It was a man, his arm outstretched in a gesture of hitchhiking. Marcos hesitated for a moment. It was rare to see someone so far from civilization at this hour, but something about the man's expression seemed so urgent. Marcos slowed down and stopped the car next to the man. He looked to be in his 40s, wearing a worn-out coat and holding a worn-out backpack. His face, although calm, had an expression of weariness and despair. "Good evening," the man said, his voice hoarse but polite. "Can you give me a ride? I'm trying to get to the next village." Marcos, although reluctant, nodded. "Get in. But it's strange that you're here at this hour. There's not much around." "My car broke down up ahead," the man replied as he put his backpack on his lap and settled into the passenger seat. The conversation began in a banal manner, with the man repeatedly thanking Marcos for his kindness. However, as they drove along the road, Marcos began to notice details that bothered him. The temperature inside the car seemed to have dropped, despite the heater being on. Furthermore, the man didn't seem to have any smell. No sweat, no perfume, not even the damp smell characteristic of someone who had spent hours outdoors. "Do you live around here?" Marcos asked. trying to hide his uneasiness. The man looked at him for a moment before answering, in a more serious tone, "I used to live there." The answer intrigued Marcos, but he decided not to insist. As they continued their journey, the atmosphere inside the car became increasingly heavy. At a certain point, Marcos noticed something even stranger. The man had no reflection in the rear-view mirror. Marcos tried to remain calm, but his mind was on high alert. He pretended to fiddle with the car's dashboard to divert his gaze from the passenger, who now seemed more introspective. That was when the man broke the silence, saying something that made Marcos's heart race. "I think you should stop here." Marcos looked at the road. There was nothing, just darkness and the straight line of asphalt disappearing into the horizon. "Here? There's nothing nearby." "It's here," the man insisted with frightening firmness. Reluctantly, Marcos pulled the car over to the side of the road. When he turned to talk to the man, the passenger seat was empty. The backpack he had brought with him was also gone. Marcos got out of the car, looking around frantically. The air was freezing, and the silence was deafening. He felt a presence around him, but saw no one. Only a heavy feeling, as if he were being watched. Suddenly, a sound caught his attention. Footsteps on the gravel, coming from behind the car. He turned quickly, but there was no one there. The car's engine sputtered and turned off, leaving Marcos immersed in darkness. Marcos managed to restart the car after a few minutes, but the feeling of fear and discomfort stayed with him until he got home. He couldn't sleep that night, remembering every detail of the encounter. The next day, he researched the road and discovered reports of other drivers who had seen a man hitchhiking in the same place. According to local legend, it was the spirit of someone who had died in an accident on that curve many years ago. The experience left Marcos with more questions than answers, but one certainty remained. Some presences are real, even when we cannot explain them. The road was a dark snake that cut through the steep hills of a mountainous region. Eduardo, an experienced truck driver, was driving there on an especially cold night. He was transporting a load of perishable food and needed to reach his destination before dawn. With the radio broken and only the constant sound of the engine to keep him company, the journey was too silent for his liking. The road was known for its dangerous curves and a scary story he had heard from other truckers at the gas station. They told of a girl who would appear on the sharpest curves, especially on nights like that, asking for help. But Eduardo had always dismissed these stories as mere urban legends, created to scare the young and inexperienced. He sighed as he made another sharp curve, slowing down to avoid any accidents. The wind was blowing hard, shaking the truck slightly. It was then that he saw her. A young woman was walking along the side of the road, barefoot and wearing only a white dress, despite the biting cold of the night. Eduardo frowned and slowed down, stopping the truck next to her. "Hey, girl! What are you doing here at this hour?" "It's dangerous," he shouted through the window. The girl stopped, looking at him with wide, sad eyes. She looked to be in her early 20s, with long dark hair and an expression of utter helplessness. "I need help," she answered, her voice low and hesitant. Eduardo looked at the deserted road and then at the girl. Something about the situation seemed strange, but he couldn't just leave her there. He opened the passenger door and waved her in. As she settled into the seat, Eduardo felt a shiver run down his spine. The temperature inside the cabin seemed to have dropped drastically, even with the heater running. "Do you live around here?" he asked, trying to sound casual. The girl shook her head. "I was with some friends, but I got lost," she replied, looking away to the window. Eduardo didn't want to press, but something about her tone felt off, as if there was more to the story than she was telling. As they drove, he tried to make conversation, but her answers were short and evasive. It was then that he noticed something peculiar. Every time he glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, her figure seemed to blur, like a blurred painting. But when he looked directly at her, she seemed perfectly normal. "Are you okay?" he asked, trying to hide his nervousness. The girl slowly turned her head toward him and smiled, a smile that seemed forced, as if she were struggling to appear human. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied, but her voice sounded different, colder. As they continued down the road, Eduardo began to feel a growing pressure in his chest, as if something invisible was squeezing his heart. He tried to ignore it, focusing on driving, but his instincts screamed that something was very wrong. As they approached one of the sharpest curves in the road, the girl finally spoke, in a tone so calm that it frightened him even more. "This is it. You can drop me off here." Eduardo looked around. There was nothing, just the empty road and a small ravine to the side. "Here? There's nothing nearby. Don't you want me to take you to a safe place?" She turned her head slowly and looked at him, her eyes now glowing with a faint reddish hue. "I'm already where I need to be." Before Eduardo could react, the girl disappeared. There was no sound, no movement. She was simply no longer there. He glanced at the now empty passenger seat and nearly lost control of the truck on the curve. At the same moment, Eduardo saw something in the rear-view mirror. It was the girl, standing in the middle of the road, staring at him as the truck drove away. Eduardo stopped the truck a few kilometers away, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. He got out to take a breath and try to understand what had just happened. His heart was beating so fast that he thought he was going to faint. The next morning, when he reached his destination, Eduardo told the story to other truck drivers. One of them, an older one, looked at him seriously. "You met the girl on the curve. She died there more than 10 years ago. They say she appears to warn you about the dangers of the road. If she was with you, she may have saved your life." The experience changed Eduardo forever. He never again drove down that road without thinking about the girl's gaze and what could have happened if he hadn't slowed down on that curve. Route 67 was surrounded by dark stories and tales of people who disappeared without a trace. It was a narrow road that wound through dense forests, rarely used except by those looking for shortcuts to save time. Among the locals, there was a common warning: avoid the road at night. Felipe, an adventurous photographer, was not the type to be intimidated by urban legends. He was returning from a trip to a small town in the countryside, in a hurry to get home. Despite the warnings of a gas station attendant about the road, he decided to take the risk. After all, the GPS indicated that it was the fastest route, and he didn't want to waste any more time. The clock read 10 p.m. when Felipe turned onto Route 67. The air seemed heavier there, and the trees formed a natural tunnel, blocking the moonlight. It was absolute silence, and the only sounds came from the car's engine and the gravel under the tires. After about 20 minutes of driving, Felipe began to notice something strange. The road, which should have been straight, seemed to stretch on forever. He was sure he should have reached the next town by now, but there was no sign of light or civilization. In addition, the fuel gauge, which had been almost full at the beginning of the trip, seemed to be dropping faster than usual. He checked the GPS again, but the signal had disappeared. Now, the screen showed only one message: recalculating. Discomfort began to take over him. Felipe tried to distract himself by turning on the radio, but all the channels were filled with static. It was then that he saw something that made him slam on the brakes. In the middle of the road, there was a sign that he was sure he had already passed. It was rusty and partially covered in moss, but the message was clear: caution, danger ahead. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered to himself, trying to ignore the growing knot in his stomach. He continued driving, slower now, watching for anything unusual. Soon, Felipe noticed something in the rear-view mirror. It was a light, dim and flickering, as if it were a flashlight or headlights from far away. He looked again and noticed that the light seemed to be getting closer, but there was no sound of an engine or movement. Curiosity overcoming fear, he pulled the car over to the side of the road. He got out and looked back, trying to see better through the darkness. The light was there, but now it seemed to float in the air, changing position as if it were dancing. "Hello? Is anyone there?" he called out, his voice echoing in the forest. No answer came, but the light began to move toward him, slowly. Feeling the panic growing, Felipe got back into the car and accelerated. However, the road seemed to change as he drove. The trees seemed taller and closer, almost as if they were leaning in to block his path. Suddenly, he saw something on the side of the road. An abandoned car, with its doors open and signs of rust covering the bodywork. Felipe slowed down to get a better look and noticed that there was something written on the fogged-up windshield. The words were clear, "Don't look back." His heart raced. Against all instincts, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw something that made his blood run cold. In the back seat of the car, a dark, indistinct figure sat, motionless, as if waiting for him. Felipe screamed and tried to accelerate even more, but the engine began to fail. The car sputtered, the speed dropped, and fear took over every fiber of his being. It was then that the figure in the rearview mirror began to move, leaning forward, as if it were approaching him. Suddenly, everything went dark. Felipe woke up a few hours later, still inside the car, but now stopped on the shoulder of a completely different road. The sun was rising, and he recognized the place. It was the beginning of Route 67, the same point where he had turned off the night before. Confused, he looked around, searching for some sign of what had happened. The car looked intact, but there was something on the dashboard that he didn't remember seeing before. An old black and white photograph showing a man standing next to a car similar to his. The man in the photo wore clothes that looked like they were from another era and had a vacant stare that seemed to follow Felipe wherever he went. Back in town, Felipe shared his experience with a few people, but no one seemed surprised. Route 67 was notorious for making travelers disappear 4 hours or even days. Some people returned, others were never seen again. Felipe decided never to drive that road again, but the photograph stayed with him, as a reminder that some journeys can take us further than we can imagine to understand. As the clock ticks down to the end of this journey through the most frightening and mysterious roads, one thing is clear. There are places that hold dark secrets beyond our comprehension. Each of these stories brought something different. The ghost traveler who disappears without a trace, the girl on the curve with her unsettling smile, and the road that consumes time and defies logic. But what do all these experiences have in common? The fear of the unknown. Whether you are a skeptic or a supernatural enthusiast, it is impossible to ignore the emotional impact these stories have on us. Perhaps they remind us to respect what we do not understand, or perhaps they serve as a warning. Not everything in the world can be explained or controlled. No matter the interpretation, the important thing is that these stories remain alive, passed down from generation to generation, fueling our imagination and leaving us with that feeling of shivers. After all, that is what makes horror so fascinating. It challenges us to confront our deepest fears and transports us to a world where logic gives way to the impossible. So, next time you're driving down a deserted road on a silent night, think twice before ignoring the signs around you. Maybe a simple hitchhiker, a strange smile, or a sharp turn are more than they seem. And of course, never forget, sometimes, what we encounter along the way can change us forever. With that, we close this video with an intense dose of suspense and mystery. If you like these stories and want to continue exploring the supernatural, leave a like, subscribe to the channel and share your experiences in the comments. Who knows? Your story might be the next one to appear here. See you in the next video. And be careful what you might encounter on the road.